In the closing months of World War II, General Henry "Hap" Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, asked MIT physicist Edward Bowles for a blueprint that would prevent American air power from sliding back into the interwar complacency that had nearly crippled rearmament in 1939. Bowles, armed with Theodore von Karman's Toward New Horizons report, advised Arnold to create a standing analytical arm, outside uniformed bureaucracy and free from quarterly profit pressure, that could scan the scientific horizon for threats and opportunities 20 or 30 years ahead. Arnold turned to Franklin Colbaum, a former Douglas aircraft test pilot who had become the company's director of engineering evaluation. On September 6, 1945, Colbaum, Douglas CEO Donald Douglas Sr., and Air Materiel Command officers met at Wright Field and drafted a contract in which Douglas would supply a Research and Development Group, quickly abbreviated Project RAND, to the Army Air Forces for a fixed fee of $640,000. The contract took effect on October 1, 1945. By Christmas, 24 engineers and analysts were working in temporary offices behind a locked door on the third floor of Douglas's Building 8 in Santa Monica. Their charter was deliberately broad: study every factor, physical or social, that might shape future air warfare, from atmospheric density gradients to Soviet industrial geography. The fledgling team's first internal memorandum, dated May 2, 1946 and titled Preliminary Design of an Experimental World-Circling Spaceship, argued that a satellite could serve as a reconnaissance platform, a communications relay, and a physics laboratory, concepts that would become reality more than a decade later. Early staff included artillery analyst Merton E. Davies, mathematician John Williams, economist Charles Hitch, and strategist Bernard Brodie, freshly arrived from Yale after publishing The Absolute Weapon. Colbaum insisted on an interdisciplinary ethos. Physicists sat next to political scientists, and former bomber navigators ran Monte Carlo simulations on hand-cranked Marchant calculators while economists estimated Soviet steel output from railroad tonnage data. Security was tight. The group occupied a windowless suite plastered with placards reading, "What you see here, when you leave here, let it stay here." Although Douglas Aircraft provided payroll and clerical support, corporate executives bristled at paying overhead for studies that did not necessarily translate into billable airframes. Meanwhile, the newly independent U.S. Air Force, created in September 1947, wanted RAND's advice without the appearance of corporate capture. Enter the Ford Foundation, whose president Paul Hoffman saw in RAND a prototype for evidence-based policy. Over a series of dinners at New York's University Club in early 1948, Hoffman, Colbaum, and Air Force Secretary Stuart Symington negotiated a three-way solution. RAND would spin off as a non-profit corporation, the Air Force would sign a sole-source research contract guaranteeing baseline funding, and Ford would provide an unrestricted endowment to buffer cash flow shocks. On May 14, 1948, the RAND Corporation was formally incorporated in Delaware with an initial Ford grant of $1 million and pledged Air Force task orders of roughly $2.5 million for fiscal 1949. The founding board included Colbaum as president, Harvard economist John Williams as vice president for research, former Undersecretary of State Robert A. Lovett, physicist Edward Bowles, and venture capitalist Lawrence Rockefeller. They adopted bylaws that barred stock issuance, capped executive compensation at levels comparable to senior civil service, and required that at least two-thirds of trustees have no financial ties to defense contractors. Within 6 months, the new corporation had leased a converted toothpaste factory at 4th Street and Colorado Avenue, today the heart of Santa Monica's tech corridor, and installed a UNIVAC 1103 computer cooled by 2 tons of refrigeration equipment. By year's end, RAND employed 187 staff members and was drafting studies on intercontinental ballistic missile guidance, Soviet bomber base vulnerability, and the sociology of conscript morale. The intellectual architecture laid between 1945 and 1948, a non-profit statutorily wedded to the Air Force yet structurally buffered by philanthropic capital, set the template for the federally funded Research and Development Center, a hybrid institution that would proliferate across Cold War America. RAND had been born in the slipstream of the Air War, but its founders had already aimed it far beyond airframes toward the broader question that would animate the next 4 decades: how to translate abstract science into strategic advantage before an adversary does the same. The decision to incorporate RAND as a non-profit rather than a profit-seeking contractor reflected a deliberate strategy to shield long-range analysis from the short time horizons of quarterly earnings reports and the deal flow incentives that shape ordinary aerospace firms. Under its May 14, 1948 Delaware charter, RAND issued no stock, barred trustees and officers from equity stakes, and stipulated that surplus revenues be reinvested in basic research or returned to the Treasury. This structure let the new corporation accept open-ended questions. What would radar-evading missiles mean for continental defense in 1965? Without having to justify each staff hour to shareholders. During budget negotiations, Air Force controllers agreed to fund indirect costs through an annually renegotiated management fee, insulating RAND from profit margin pressure yet still imposing government audit rights. The model anticipated the federally funded Research and Development Center category that the Bureau of the Budget formalized in 1967, long-term, single-sponsor laboratories forbidden to market commercial products, privileged to receive sole-source contracts, and expected to cultivate deep institutional memory unavailable to rotating beltway consultants. Early governance fused academic gravitas with national security clout. Franklin Colbohm served as president, but analytical direction lay in the Research Council chaired by economist John Williams, who had helped run wartime inflation forecasting for the Office of Price Administration. Former Under-Secretary of State Robert A. Lovett brought cabinet-level access. Financier Lawrence Rockefeller represented the Ford Foundation's endowment interest. Mathematician Oswald Veblen provided Princeton's pure science credibility. Several trustees, most notably MIT radar pioneer Edward Bowles and Caltech aerodynamicist Theodore von Karman, held concurrent seats on the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, ensuring that RAND's agenda meshed with uniformed requirements while remaining buffered from day-to-day procurement politics. Board bylaws required a 2/3 majority, including at least one academic and one former senior military officer, for any research project exceeding $1 million, a safeguard against pet projects that lacked cross-domain consensus. The Air Force relationship crystallized in late 1948 when General Joseph McNarney, Deputy Chief of Staff for Material, asked RAND to create a standing analytical unit exclusively focused on operational concepts, basing modes, and force structure trade-offs. This became Project Air Force, a renewable contract whose statement of work allowed RAND to embed civilian economists and operations researchers inside Strategic Air Command simulators at Offutt and to run field surveys of bomber crew fatigue during Arctic refueling drills. Unlike typical weapons development contracts tied to specific hardware milestones, Project Air Force funded portfolios of studies, some classified top-secret atomic, others openly published in RAND's R-Series monographs. The arrangement proved durable. When Congress later capped sole-source cost-plus contracts, RAND's non-profit status and Project Air Force's research clause exempted the work from competitive bidding, and successive Air Force chiefs, Twining, LeMay, McConnell, renewed the umbrella agreement with minor tweaks. By the early 1960s, the Project Air Force template had been copied by other services, spawning the Navy-sponsored Center for Naval Analyses and the Army-aligned Arroyo Center, but RAND's governance DNA, non-profit charter, trustee firewall, and single-sponsor FFRDC contract remained the canonical blueprint for how the United States institutionalized think tank science in the national security state. Bernard Brodie arrived at RAND in the summer of 1948, having already written the book that recast nuclear weapons from battlefield instruments into tools of political coercion. In The Absolute Weapon, he argued that the atomic bomb made victory in the old Clausewitzian sense obsolete. The central objective of strategy had shifted from defeating enemy forces to preventing their use. Inside RAND, he refined that axiom with empirical spreadsheets of bomber load factors, sortie generation rates, and Soviet urban demographics. Brodie's weekly seminar, held on Tuesday evenings in a smoke-thick conference room nicknamed the Dust Bowl, became the crucible where economists, mathematicians, and former bomber pilots debated whether 10, 50, or 500 warheads were enough to stabilize mutual fear. His 1959 monograph Strategy in the Missile Age introduced the deterrence triad of punishment, denial, and reassurance, insisting that credibility depended less on numbers than on the assured ability to strike a second time after absorbing a Soviet blow. While Brody set the conceptual frame, Albert Wallstetter supplied the engineering audit that showed how fragile that credibility actually was. Commissioned in 1951 to study Strategic Air Command's forward bases, Wallstetter and his wife Roberta pored over satellite photos, tanker schedules, and Soviet runway cratering doctrine. Their 1954 report, Selection and Use of Strategic Air Bases, shocked the air staff. Over 75% of SAC's heavy bombers could be destroyed on the ground in a first strike if the Soviets invested a modest number of megatons and synchronized attacks across time zones. Wallstetter recommended dispersal to inland bases, rapid runway repair kits, sealed silo ICBMs, and continuous airborne alert. These prescriptions, derided by some generals as robber barons' wish lists, nonetheless guided the construction of Minuteman silos, the hardening of command bunkers at Cheyenne Mountain, and the development of the KC-135 tanker force that made global airborne alert feasible. More subtly, Wallstetter introduced probabilistic survivability analysis, using Monte Carlo simulations on RAND's IBM 704 to show that even a 10% improvement in alert rates could tilt the deterrence balance. Game theory provided the lingua franca binding these empirical and conceptual strands. John von Neumann, already famous for the Minimax theorem, spent intermittent weeks at RAND between 1947 and 1955. With analyst Oscar Morgenstern, he converted two-person zero-sum models into payoff matrices for scenarios like first strike advantage and city for base trade. Von Neumann's casual remark, "If you say why not bomb them tomorrow, I say why not today," became RAND folklore, encapsulating the logic that a preemptive optimum existed if the damage curves crossed a certain threshold. John Nash, visiting from Princeton in 1950, generalized to non-zero-sum equilibria, allowing RAND mathematicians to model tacit bargaining situations where mutual restraint could emerge without formal treaties. These equations fed into policy memos that reached the National Security Council by way of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board. Herman Kahn, a portly physicist with a baritone laugh audible 2 corridors away, translated the abstract theorems into technicolor narrative. His 1958 Blowtorch briefings marched audiences up a 44-rung escalation ladder, from diplomatic démarches to spasm war, arguing that policymakers required a vocabulary for the intermediate rungs lest they stumble from incident to apocalypse. Kahn's simulations featured civilian evacuation curves, iodine tablet inventories, and the economic rebound times of Detroit versus Donetsk, leading him to assert that nuclear war was thinkable and therefore planable. Although many colleagues found his tone macabre, Kahn's insistence on graded response underpinned Secretary of Defense McNamara's later, flexible response, doctrine. Thomas Schelling, arriving at RAND in 1956 after State Department service, shifted emphasis from force levels to strategic communication. Drawing on bargaining puzzles, he showed that the power to hurt was most useful when held in reserve and credibly signaled. In RAND's R-Series paper, Strategy of Conflict, Drafts, Schelling coined compellence to distinguish active coercion from passive deterrence and illustrated brinkmanship as the art of staking mutual risk, analogous to two climbers bound by a rope edging toward a precipice. His concept of focal points explained how unspoken coordination norms guided crises like the 1948 Berlin blockade, offering policymakers intuition on how limited wars might be contained. By 1960, the Brody-Wallstetter-Kahn-Schelling lineage had forged a coherent but internally contested framework. Deterrence rested on survivable forces demonstrated by quantitative vulnerability analysis, operated along an escalation spectrum mapped by scenario gaming, and communicated through signals decoded by game-theoretic logic. RAND memoranda distilled these ideas into the SIOP targeting doctrine, Polaris deployment plans, and Berlin crisis contingency options. Though academics would later debate their moral adequacy, the intellectual architecture they created governed U.S. nuclear posture throughout the Cold War and remains embedded in modern deterrence theory. The intellectual roots of systems analysis at RAND lay in wartime operations research cells that had optimized convoy routing and bomber formations, but Charles Hitch, a Chicago-trained mathematician and economist, was the first to give those ad hoc techniques a comprehensive, monetized grammar. Arriving at Rand in 1948 after budget work for the Office of Price Administration, he began dissecting Air Force requests into functional slices: how many delivered megatons on target, a dollar bought, how sortie rates varied with basing altitude, what redundancy levels minimized expected civilian deaths under different Soviet attack scenarios. By 1954 his team had developed cost-effectiveness ratios that could compare unlike systems, Minuteman missiles, B-52 bombers, radar picket ships, on a single scale of mission output per dollar of life cycle cost. Hitch's 1959 book The Economics of Defense in the Nuclear Age, co-authored with Roland McKean, distilled thousands of RAND worksheets into a method that treated each weapons program as one among many competing ways to accomplish a clearly defined objective. The key move was to shift analysis from the traditional line-item approach, procure X aircraft, Y tanks, to a mission perspective, deter nuclear attack, defend Europe for 90 days, interdict maritime supply lines. Only after objectives were agreed would analysts compute the cheapest portfolio of forces that could satisfy them under uncertainty. A young Oxford-educated Rhodes Scholar, Alan Enthoven, joined Hitch's unit in 1956 and pushed the framework toward explicit marginal analysis. Borrowing Kuhn-Tucker conditions from mathematical programming, Enthoven calculated the cost of adding 1 additional percentage point of confidence to bomber readiness or missile hardness and showed that beyond certain thresholds the incremental dollars produced diminishing deterrent returns. He also insisted on embedding technical risks in the calculus. If a new re-entry vehicle had a 30% probability of failure, the expected deterrence value had to be discounted accordingly, a practice unheard of in conventional budget drills. When John F. Kennedy tapped automobile executive Robert McNamara to run the Pentagon in 1961, McNamara brought Hitch in as Assistant Secretary of Defense, Comptroller, and installed Enthoven as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Systems Analysis. Over 6 frenetic months they transplanted RAND's internal templates into a department-wide planning programming budgeting system, or PPBS. The process began each spring with a Presidential National Security Directive outlining strategic goals. Pentagon analysts then produced Program Objective Memoranda, POMs, that translated goals into 5-year force structures with explicit dollar, manpower, and performance tables. These POMs fed into an August Systems Analysis Review where Enthoven's shop ran cost-effectiveness comparisons, challenged service wish lists, and issued issue papers highlighting overlaps and gaps. Finally, the reconciled program flowed into the formal budget and was transmitted to Congress each January. The new system abolished the traditional service barons who had guarded their own procurement stovepipes, replacing them with cross-cutting program managers responsible for entire mission areas such as strategic deterrence, tactical air, or anti-submarine warfare. Results appeared quickly. PPBS killed the Air Force's 600-plane B-70 Valkyrie bomber buy, trimmed the Navy's Polaris missile program to the minimum number needed for assured second strike, and funneled savings into the hard silo Minuteman force judged most cost-effective for deterrence. It also created analytical templates that could be audited and replicated, enabling congressional committees to interrogate budget justifications with unprecedented numerical detail. President Lyndon Johnson, impressed by the Pentagon's new rigor, ordered PPBS extended to all executive agencies in an August 1965 directive. NASA adapted the system to track Saturn V, Apollo, and later shuttle cost profiles. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare used it to compare Head Start, Medicare, and mental health block grants on per-beneficiary impact curves. The Office of Economic Opportunity adopted it for war on poverty programs. Although many civilian departments later relaxed PPBS's annual rigor, its logic, define objectives, generate options, evaluate costs and outputs under uncertainty, became embedded in federal grant guidance, cost-benefit analysis under the Office of Management and Budget Circular A-94, and the Defense Acquisition Systems Milestones A, B, and C. Over the decades the original RAND toolkit has evolved into options analysis and portfolio assessment, found in agencies from NASA's Mars mission comparisons to the Department of Health and Human Services pandemic stockpile decisions. Yet the DNA is unmistakable, a disciplined insistence that public dollars be allocated only after quantitatively weighing alternative ways to achieve explicit goals, with uncertainty treated not as afterthought but as a design parameter. That paradigm, born in Hitch's Santa Monica cubicle and operationalized by Enthoven and McNamara, continues to structure how the United States thinks about everything from hypersonic missile procurement to Medicaid expansion trade-offs, making systems analysis and PPBS one of RAND's most enduring contributions to governance. Long before network became a household word, RAND analysts were grappling with how to stitch radar sites, interceptor squadrons, and command centers into a unified air defense nervous system that could react in minutes, not hours, to high-altitude bombers. In 1949, economist Lyle Johnson and mathematician John Williams produced a classified study showing that unless data moved electronically from Alaska's early warning radars to continental fighter bases, Soviet Tu-4s could exploit gaps in the picket line. Their recommendation, that continental defense required real-time digital links and centralized computing, flowed to MIT's Lincoln Laboratory and became one of the founding rationales for SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment. RAND itself did not build SAGE's colossal and /FSQ-7 computers. That task fell to IBM under Air Force contract. But RAND's requirements studies specified the data rates, redundancy paths, and operator workload assumptions that guided MIT's Whirlwind and Lincoln staff. Throughout the 1950s, RAND engineers visited the SAGE test site at Lexington weekly, logging flight simulator runs and feeding back human factors data that refined the track-while-scan algorithms and the iconic light gun interface. As ballistic missile threats eclipsed manned bombers, the question shifted from radar fusion to message survivability after a nuclear first strike. Paul Baran, a Polish-born electrical engineer hired by RAND in 1959, was asked to design a command and control network that could function even if dozens of nodes were vaporized. Baran immersed himself in queuing theory and Claude Shannon's noisy channel theorems, concluding that a centrally switched network, even SAGE's, would fail catastrophically. Between 1962 and 1964 he produced the 11-volume On Distributed Communications, proposing that messages be chopped into equal-sized packets, each routed independently through a mesh of hot potato links where no single node was indispensable. He calculated that with a modest 0.1 second store and forward delay per hop, a 128 kilobit per second trunk network could deliver bombing orders nationwide in under 2 seconds, even if half its nodes were destroyed. The Air Force judged the concept sound, but outside its charter, the memos nevertheless reached ARPA program manager Bob Taylor, who hired Bolt, Beranek and Newman to implement packet switching in the 1969 ARPANET. Baran's topology diagrams, redundant lattices, random graphs, and fishnet arcs appear almost unaltered in early ARPANET design notes, though British computer scientist Donald Davies independently coined the term packet at the National Physical Laboratory the same year. RAND's computing culture nurtured other digital seeds. The in-house JONIAC computer, operational in 1953 and named for John von Neumann, hosted experiments in heuristic search that later informed the general problem solver of Simon and Newell at Carnegie Tech. RAND programmers Cliff Shaw and Bill Wright devised the IPLV list processing language on JONIAC, introducing the linked list data structure that became the backbone of Lisp and most modern programming. In 1963, RAND unveiled JOS, one of the first interactive time-sharing languages, allowing economists to run regression models in conversational dialogue rather than batch decks. JOS's command line style influenced BASIC at Dartmouth and the early mini-computer culture that followed. Interdisciplinarity permeated the corridors. Across the hall from radar analysts, social scientist Olaf Helmer was perfecting the Delphi polling method, in which experts iteratively converge on consensus via anonymized questionnaires, a human network protocol mirroring Baran's Technical 1. Downstairs, psychologist Alan Newell collaborated with graphic artists to prototype interactive plotting, a precursor to computer-aided design. Even RAND's art department contributed. Howard Tappan sketched packet switch diagrams readable by generals unfamiliar with Boolean algebra, reinforcing RAND's conviction that ideas traveled faster when encoded in clear visual language. By the late 1960s, these disparate threads, air defense networking, distributed communication theory, interactive computing, and structured consensus, had radiated outward. Sage technicians founded air traffic control companies, ARPANET pioneers cited Barron in RFC-1, Delphi migrated to civilian forecasting for energy and health policy. The common denominator was RAND's insistence that complex technological systems be treated as socio-technical wholes, where information, machines, and human decision loops must be co-designed for resilience. In that sense, RAND did not merely contribute an idea or two to the digital era. It served as an incubator where the modern grammar of networking, redundancy, packets, interaction, feedback, was forged under the existential pressure of thermonuclear risk, then released into the civilian world. From the moment the Kennedy administration expanded Military Assistance Command in Saigon, RAND became the Pentagon's in-house lens on a war fought as much for hearts and minds as for terrain. Under Project Agile, a Southeast Asia team was formed in 1964 and staffed with analysts who spoke French or Vietnamese and had already logged field time in counterinsurgency studies from Algeria to the Philippines. Joseph B. F. Rust, an anthropologist fluent in Montagnard dialects, directed field surveys that asked Viet Cong defectors why they had joined and what incentives might lure them away. John Pfaff, a former Marine intelligence officer, designed a hamlet evaluation system that scored every village on a 5-point stability scale, data later fed into Robert McNamara's weekly progress charts. Daniel Ellsberg, freshly arrived from a stint with the State Department in Phnom Penh and still recovering from wounds sustained on Highway 13 near Ben Cat, wrote trip reports arguing that pacification metrics disguised a battlefield trending toward stalemate. The team's classified memoranda, circulating under the RA series numbers, warned that body count inflation, forced relocations, and indiscriminate airstrikes were generating grievance faster than Saigon could provide security. Yet each spring review in Washington cherry-picked the optimistic tables while ignoring the cautionary footnotes, a disconnect that sharpened Ellsberg's skepticism about the integrity of the policy process itself. In late 1967, Secretary of Defense McNamara, now privately doubting victory, commissioned RAND to store and catalog the Pentagon's internal Vietnam history. Leslie Gelb, head of the Defense Department's International Security Affairs staff, oversaw the effort, while Ellsberg and research assistant Anthony Russo spent nights in a RAND warehouse in Santa Monica photocopying 7,000 pages of what would be labeled United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1967. After the Tet Offensive shattered public confidence, Ellsberg concluded that only full disclosure could break what he called government's addiction to self-deception. Smuggling the bound volumes out in a briefcase, he leaked them first to Senator William Fulbright and then, when hearings stalled, to the New York Times in June 1971. The Pentagon Papers painted a consistent pattern of escalation hidden beneath public declarations of restraint, directly contradicting years of official testimony. For RAND, this was an institutional shock. A think tank founded on the premise of fearless but confidential advice found its internal ethic weaponized against the secrecy that gave it access. The fallout was immediate. Justice Department prosecutors raided RAND's Vault 6 record room. Security managers installed cipher-lock doors, separate safes for every project over top secret, and a badge color code system that limited corridor access by clearance level. Where researchers had once wandered between economics and systems analysis divisions, new need-to-know rules created information silos, eroding the interdisciplinary serendipity that had produced early nuclear strategy breakthroughs. Congressional committees, emboldened by public outrage, began subpoenaing RAND's Vietnam studies, and the Freedom of Information Act amendments of 1974 broadened their reach. Donor relations shifted. The Ford Foundation required RAND to file annual reports on safeguards. The Air Force modified the Project Air Force contract to mandate random compliance audits. Analysts reacted in two directions. Some left for universities, convinced that open scholarship was incompatible with classified sponsorship. Others doubled down on secure but controversial work, such as wargaming covert operations in Laos. The episode also seeded a broader transparency movement. Ellsberg's act, though condemned by many RAND executives as betrayal, inspired internal debates that produced the corporation's first declassification review board in 1973, leading to the public release of more than 100 R-series reports on civil defense and space exploration. Yet the paradox remained: RAND's value to policymakers lay in its access to secrets, while its credibility in the public arena now depended on openness. Navigating that tension became a central governance issue, shaping non-disclosure agreements, publication queues, and the delicate art of writing unclassified summaries that conveyed analytic rigor without revealing sensitive inputs. Vietnam thus marked the moment when RAND's internal dissent escaped the vault, forcing the think tank world to confront the limits of private advice in a democratic society and ushering in a new era of tightened security protocols matched by heightened demands for accountability. The détente era squeezed defense budgets, and RAND's leadership recognized that survival demanded intellectual markets beyond missiles and war games. In 1971, President Henry Rowan assembled an interdisciplinary task force, economists Joseph Newhouse and Emmett Keeler, physician John Wasserman, and statistician Robert H. Brooke, to tackle a civilian question then roiling Capitol Hill: how much medical care would people consume if price were no object, and what health gains would ensue? From that query emerged the RAND health insurance experiment, the largest social science randomized controlled trial the United States had yet attempted. Between 1974 and 1982, more than 7,000 families in 6 regions, Seattle, Dayton, Charleston, Fitchburg, rural Georgia, and tiny Franklin County, Massachusetts, were assigned to insurance plans with copayments ranging from 0 to 95%. Field teams weighed babies in mobile clinics, abstracted more than 2 million pages of medical records, and ran biannual household surveys coded on then exotic magnetic tapes. When the final regressions were printed on tractor feed paper in 1984, the results overturned prevailing wisdom. Free care did increase utilization by roughly a third, but except for the poorest and sickest enrollees, it produced few measurable health improvements. Those findings guided the 1983 Medicare Prospective Payment System, validated Health Maintenance Organization cost sharing, and still inform Affordable Care Act actuarial tables 4 decades later. Diversification also took institutional form. Recognizing that traditional PhD programs produced either narrow technocrats or theory-heavy academics, RAND launched its own graduate school in 1970. The first in the United States to grant a doctorate in policy analysis. Students were recruited from physics, sociology, engineering, and languages, sworn into security clearances if their dissertation data required it, and plunged into live projects ranging from Soviet naval logistics to Los Angeles air quality models. Coursework mixed stochastic calculus, ethnographic methods, and microsimulation coding on CDC cyber mainframes. By the time the program was renamed the Frederick S. Vipardie RAND Graduate School in 2003, it had produced over 500 PhDs who populated CBO cost-scoring units, World Bank evaluation offices, and startup data science teams, embedding RAND's quantitative rigor across the policy ecosystem. Urban America provided another laboratory. After the 1965 Watts uprising, the Ford Foundation and the Department of Justice funded RAND to examine whether patrol randomization could deter crime. Analysts Jack Green and George Kelling partnered with the Kansas City Police Department to conduct controlled beat density experiments. Their 1974 report showed traditional cruiser saturation had little impact on crime rates, prompting a shift toward directed patrols and later community policing models. Parallel studies quantified the effect of 2-officer teams, dispatch response times, and even the luminance of streetlights, producing a data-driven policing vocabulary that still shapes CompStat dashboards. Energy crises then pushed RAND into futurist modeling. Engineers Brian Chow and Robert Lempert built long-range stochastic scenarios comparing coal gasification, breeder reactors, and solar thermal fields, influencing Department of Energy R/&D portfolios during the Carter administration. By 1980, non-defense contracts constituted nearly 40% of RAND's revenue. Health, education, criminal justice, and energy divisions cross-pollinated with the legacy military groups. An analyst might spend mornings optimizing strategic airlift command sorties and afternoons running Monte Carlo simulations of preschool cognitive outcomes. The diversification did more than fill budget gaps. It validated the think tank's core claim that complex social problems, like strategic ones, could be attacked with disciplined empiricism, probabilistic reasoning, and a readiness to test intuition against real-world data. The Soviet collapse confronted RAND with a double shock. the strategic adversary that had justified most of its portfolio vanished, and U.S. defense spending fell from 6% of GDP in 1989 to barely 3% by 1997. Rather than shrink, RAND redeployed its analytic machinery toward new threat vectors. Terrorism risk assessment came first. In 1991, terrorism analyst Brian Jenkins convened a cross-division task force to quantify likelihood and consequence of attacks on U.S. diplomatic posts, commercial airlines, and critical infrastructure. The group blended actuarial techniques from RAND's health insurance models with game-theoretic attacker-defender scenarios, producing a set of probabilistic risk curves that fed into State Department site hardening and FAA passenger screening rules. When the Air Force created a Homeland Defense Directorate in 1994, RAND established Project Air Force Homeland Security cells in Arlington and Santa Monica to wargame domestic base protection, chemical plume modeling for urban areas, and surveillance radar coverage gaps over the Gulf Coast. These studies prefigured many of the policies formalized after the 9/11 attacks, including layered airport security, blast-resistant window retrofits for federal buildings, and contingency planning for anthrax aerosolization. Parallel work emerged in cyberspace. Drawing on Paul Barron's legacy, computer scientists John Arquilla and David Ronfelt coined the phrase "netwar" in 1993 to describe decentralized, network-enabled conflict. Their monographs argued that hostile actors, from Mexican Zapatistas to Balkan separatists, were already using email lists and primitive bulletin boards to outmaneuver slower state hierarchies. RAND's cyber team, led by Richard Mezek and Martin Libicki, constructed notional attack trees for power grid SCADA systems, financial clearinghouses, and military C4 ISR networks. They introduced the concept of cyber deterrence by denial, where redundancy, rapid forensics, and public-private information sharing raise an attacker's cost curve. After the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, RAND's resilience metrics became embedded in the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, while the Tallinn-based NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence borrowed the taxonomy for its annual Locked Shields exercises. Global reach required bricks-and-mortar footholds. In 1992, RAND opened a small office in Leiden, Netherlands, later moving to Cambridge and Brussels as RAND Europe. Its first project examined the cost-effectiveness of high-speed rail versus motorways for the Trans-European network, but the affiliate quickly added defense policy assessments for NATO expansion, health technology appraisals for the British National Health Service, and migration flow modeling for the European Commission. RAND Australia followed in 2014, headquartered in Canberra, where analysts have since evaluated submarine acquisition options, Pacific fiber optic security, and indigenous health outcome disparities. These overseas centers operate under separate legal entities to comply with host nation laws yet share RAND's core database and peer review pipeline, enabling a report on Baltic air defense to draw on econometric code originally written for Melbourne's infrastructure scenarios. The post-Cold War pivot also reshaped RAND's client map inside the United States. The Justice Department funded studies of right-wing militia networks, FEMA commissioned catastrophe bond analytics for earthquake and hurricane risks. The Centers for Disease Control asked RAND to model hospital surge capacity for bioterror events. Each project recycled systems analysis DNA, objective functions, Monte Carlo uncertainty runs, sensitivity plots, into domains unimaginable to RAND's founders. By the second decade of the 21st century, roughly half of RAND's annual revenue derived from non-defense sponsors, yet the organization's brand still rested on its Cold War ethos, rigorous, interdisciplinary, and relentlessly quantitative. In this transformed landscape, RAND evolved from a single adversary think tank into a distributed, globally networked policy laboratory tackling everything from quantum crypto arms races to pandemic logistics, illustrating how an institution built for strategic bombing adapted to an era where threats travel at the speed of data as often as the speed of sound. In the 1950s, RAND confronted problems: Soviet technological surprise, agricultural demand swings, future battlefield medical requirements, that resisted classical statistics because the data were fragmentary, future-oriented, and tangled with value judgments. Olaf Helmer, a German-trained logician who had worked on Russell and Whitehead's Principia translation, joined RAND in 1946 and, with mathematician Norman Dockey, set out to discipline expert hunches with formal structure. Helmer observed that panels meeting face-to-face tended to collapse into hierarchy. The loudest colonel or Nobel laureate squelched dissent, and the group converged too fast on the conventional view. To counteract these social biases, Helmer and Dockey invented the Delphi method, a multi-round, anonymous polling process in which experts recorded quantitative estimates and qualitative rationales on questionnaires that were then aggregated by statisticians. After each round, participants received a feedback sheet showing the median forecast and the interquartile spread, along with carefully curated arguments for extreme positions. Confronted with the distribution, but not the names, of their colleagues' opinions, panelists revised their numbers in the next round. The sequence continued until successive medians differed by less than a preset tolerance or the variance reached a stable plateau. In pilot runs on the likelihood of a Soviet ICBM breakthrough, Delphi reduced the standard deviation of range estimates from 65% to 18% within 3 rounds while preserving minority rationales in the comment fields. By 1964, the Air Force regarded Delphi as robust enough to plan tanker fleet recapitalization. Soon the technique migrated beyond defense, guiding Department of Agriculture projections for global wheat demand and even setting enrollment targets for California's master plan on higher education. Half a century later, RAND faced a different epistemic wall: deep uncertainty, situations where analysts cannot agree on the probability distributions of key variables because the system itself may evolve in unanticipated ways. Climate change, autonomous vehicle safety regulation, and Colorado River water rights fell in this category. Assigning a single probability to each scenario felt like astrology disguised as mathematics. Robert Lempert, a physicist-turned-policy analyst, responded by forging robust decision-making, or RDM, in the mid-1990s. Where traditional cost-benefit analysis starts with a forecast and optimizes a policy for that future, RDM inverts the logic. It begins with a wide ensemble of plausible futures, generated by Latin hypercube sampling of uncertain parameters, then stress tests candidate policies across this landscape. The analyst looks for strategies that perform good enough in most futures rather than perfectly in one. Advanced visualization tools, pioneered by RAND's Frederick S. Hippardie Center, portray vulnerabilities as red clusters on a scatterplot of future states. Policymakers can then adjust levers, investment timing, water pricing triggers, levy heights, until the red shrinks to an acceptable risk envelope. RDM's baptism came in 2000 when the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California asked for guidance on reservoir expansion. Lempert's team ran 3 million synthetic climate trajectories and recommended adaptive triggers tied to snowpack telemetry rather than a single capital-intensive dam. The strategy saved billions and became a case study included in the 2014 UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Today, RDM undergirds decisions as disparate as NASA's Mars Sample Return launch windows, the Dutch Delta program's sea-level defenses, and the Federal Reserve's stress tests of mortgage portfolios under climate-related economic shocks. While Delphi and RDM addressed forecast quality and policy robustness, RAND also needed microfoundations for complex social behavior where aggregate equations blurred individual agency. Agent-based modeling filled this niche. In the late 1980s, computer scientist Jeffrey Steinbrenner and physicist Josh Epstein began coding Sugarscape, an artificial society of digital agents that harvested virtual sugar according to simple rules. When the agents were endowed with metabolism, reproduction, trade, and contagious agents representing disease, macro phenomena, economic inequality curves, epidemic waves, emerged spontaneously. RAND expanded the framework for epidemiological preparedness. During the 2001 anthrax letter attacks, Susan Perkel's team coupled an agent model of mailroom workers, postal routing nodes, and spore decay rates to assess exposure probabilities across the eastern seaboard. The results shaped CDC prophylaxis distribution. In 2006, RAND's Global Health Group adapted the model to avian influenza, demonstrating that school closure timing mattered more than blanket travel bans. Agent-based code later migrated to autonomous systems wargaming. Engineers scripted hundreds of drone swarms with machine learning guidance and let them compete against layered air defenses. Analysts could then test rules of engagement, bandwidth choke points, and electronic warfare doctrines before hardware ever flew. These methodologies cross-pollinated. Delphi panels provided the structured judgments that seeded parameter ranges for RDM simulations. RDM stress tests revealed where additional expert rounds might narrow uncertainty. Agent-based runs generated synthetic data against which Delphi narratives could be sanity checked. Together they forged a trilogy of techniques that pushed RAND's analytic frontier from deterministic warplanning matrices toward a probabilistic, adaptive, and bottom-up understanding of policy problems. They also changed the organizational culture. Project managers once content with a single expected value curve now expect tornado charts, vulnerability and response dashboards, and ensemble runs numbering in the tens of thousands. Policy clients, from the U.S. Army Futures Command to the Gates Foundation, now commission studies that blend all three methods: a Delphi to elicit unknown unknowns, an agent simulation to explore emergent behavior, and RDM to craft strategies resilient to whatever reality ultimately unfolds. In an age where pandemics leap continents in days and neural networks invent tactics faster than humans can review code, RAND's methodological toolkit keeps expanding, but its ethos remains the same: confront uncertainty not by wishing it away but by making it measurable, navigable, and, where possible, an asset for more informed, democratic choice. 3/4 of a century after its birth, RAND confronts a paradox: its analytic machinery has never been more sought after, yet the political ecology in which it operates is more suspicious of concentrated expertise than at any time since Vietnam. Critics on the left accuse RAND of laundering defense industry wish lists under the veneer of scholarly neutrality, while populists on the right charge that its technocratic culture bypasses democratic deliberation. Inside the Beltway, budget hawks scrutinize the legal category that protects RAND's special status as a federally funded research and development center, pointing to Office of Management and Budget Circular A-11, Section 81, which grants FFRDCs exemption from full and open competition so long as they avoid inherently governmental functions. A 2016 Government Accountability Office review found no outright violations but warned that the revolving door, former admirals on RAND's board, RAND analysts departing for deputy undersecretary posts, could blur lines between neutral advice and embedded influence. Civil society watchdogs cite the 2003 creation of the RAND Qatar Policy Institute, funded by the Qatar Foundation, as evidence that foreign entities can purchase Western think tank prestige. RAND responds that the Doha office closed in 2013 and that all donations since 2016 are posted on a public transparency portal listing amounts, topic areas, and conflict mitigation plans approved by an independent ethics committee. Pharmaceutical grants have also drawn fire. In 2019, health policy researchers accepted unrestricted funding from a coalition of biotech firms to model value-based pricing for gene therapies. Although RAND openly published its methodology and listed sponsors, critics argued that modeling assumptions, 10-year amortization of therapy costs and a 2% discount rate, tilted scenarios toward industry-friendly conclusions. RAND countered by creating an internal red team of economists tasked with stress testing sponsor-funded models before release. Even as it defends its credibility, RAND is embedding itself in some of 21st-century geopolitics' trickiest domains. Artificial intelligence safety tops the list. Since 2018, PhoEB, Ro's Algorithmic Justice Research Unit has cataloged bias amplification in predictive policing software and hospital triage algorithms, sparking pilot interventions with the Department of Health and Human Services to mandate algorithmic audit trails. RAND engineers partnered with the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center to draft the 2020 Responsible AI Strategy and Implementation Pathway, writing annexes on model card metadata and continuous monitoring that were later adopted in DoD Instruction 3000.09 on autonomous weapons. On Capitol Hill, RAND testimony supplied the comparative law tables that shaped the Algorithmic Accountability Act's transparency clauses. Now the think tank is prototyping a trust score framework, Bayesian error bounds around model outputs, to help courts gauge liability in self-driving car accidents. That work sits alongside quantum technology analyses led by physicist Susan Bearden. Her 2021 report mapped global supply chains for niobium kaolin diffusion crucibles and high-purity hafnium chloride, materials essential to supervised qubit fabrication, and warned that China controlled 62% of refining capacity. A follow-on study calculated the cost of post-quantum cryptographic migration for U.S. federal networks at $3.1 billion over 8 years, influencing language in the Quantum Computing Cybersecurity Preparedness Act of 2022. Great power competition has pulled RAND back toward its roots. Indo-Pacific Command commissioned a multi-year series of war games exploring a 2027 Taiwan contingency in which hypersonic missile salvos degrade Andersen Air Force Base within 48 hours. RAND analysts integrated satellite rework cycle times, Philippine basing rights scenarios, undersea cable cut risks, and semantic sentiment mining of regional social media to simulate cascading deterrence failures. Findings, delivered to 4-star briefings in 2022, recommended stockpiling dispersion kits for F-35 sustainment, forward deploying rapid agile combat employment packages to highway strips on Okinawa, and reinforcing psychological operations capabilities to counter PLA disinformation campaigns that aim to fracture Japanese public support. At the same time, RAND Europe, working with NATO's Stratcom Center of Excellence, released methodologies to quantify semantic infiltration on Telegram channels across the Baltics, applying causal inference time series models that identify content spikes correlated with opinion shifts in monthly Eurobarometer polls. Methodologically, RAND's toolkit is expanding at the intersection of high-performance computing, advanced causal analytics, and participatory foresight. A petascale cluster hosted at Lawrence Livermore, secured via Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, now runs agent-based simulations of 330 million synthetic Americans interacting with climate-exacerbated disaster sequences. The model stitches individual health profiles, commuting patterns, and social media rumor contagion, enabling FEMA to test vaccine allocation strategies under simultaneous wildfire and hurricane seasons. On the causal inference front, econometrician Samantha Ortega has developed hierarchical Bayesian structural time series models that isolate the impact of disinformation purges on county-level vaccination rates, informing social platform content moderation policy. These statistical engines feed into participatory foresight exercises where stakeholders, from rural mayors to TikTok content creators, manipulate scenario dashboards, adjust taxation levers or media trust coefficients, and watch real-time Monte Carlo outputs cascade across economic and social metrics. The premise echoes RAND's original systems analysis creed but democratizes it. Citizens can explore the same uncertainty spaces that once lay solely in classified vaults. Still, critics worry that sophistication breeds opacity. Deep neural network emulators compress thousands of differential equations into inscrutable tensors. Adaptive agent systems evolve emergent strategies that even designers struggle to explain. RAND's ethics board now requires interpretability memos alongside model deliverables, documenting variable importance, fairness audits, and error surfaces. Younger analysts advocate open methods publishing, releasing cleaned code and data within 1 year of project completion unless legal constraints forbid. Defense sponsors tolerate partial openness, but commercial partners, particularly tech giants funding AI mis-disinformation projects, sometimes invoke trade secret clauses. The tension intensifies debates over FFRDC ethics. Can a federally privileged entity accept proprietary constraints that impede peer review? RAND's board has imposed a ceiling. No more than 15% of annual revenue may carry non-disclosure clauses tighter than DoD's CUI regime, and every such contract must undergo a public interest override review. Financial diversification has also raised eyebrows. In fiscal 2022, 31% of RAND's income came from non-US sources. The European Commission, the Australian Department of Defense, and philanthropic tech titans such as the Musk and Bezos Foundations. Congressional staffers ask whether a think tank advising Indopacom on China strategy should simultaneously consult for Singapore's sovereign wealth fund on semiconductor investment. RAND replies that firewall protocols prevent cross-project access and that conflict reviews benchmark each engagement against 3 criteria: contribution to public welfare, methodological integrity, and adherence to U.S. export control law. Even so, watchdog groups push for statutory caps on foreign funding of FFRDCs. Looking forward, 3 trajectories stand out. First, hybrid threat analysis, simultaneous kinetic, digital, cognitive, and biological vectors, will dominate near-term demand. The COVID-19 pandemic, Russian energy blackmail, and drone swarms over Ukraine convince policymakers that future crises will mash together public health logistics, space asset vulnerability, and narrative warfare. RAND's cross-domain matrix, already employed in Baltic air defense studies, is being scaled to integrate genomic surveillance, undersea cable repair times, and TikTok sentiment flows. Second, quantum-safe architecture will require marrying cryptographic proofs with supply chain geopolitics. RAND is partnering with the Open Quantum Institute to create a decision support tool that weights algorithmic migration timelines against rare earth bottlenecks, workforce gaps, and export control escalations. Third, deliberative democracy may migrate inside model loops through citizen juries embedded in RDM frameworks. Pilot projects with the city of Barcelona are testing how residents, after VR immersion in future heat islands, adjust their preferences on green corridors versus energy tariffs. The resulting utility functions then feed back into robust decision ensembles, effectively closing the loop between expert simulation and public values. Whether RAND can navigate the ethical and political minefields of the 21st century hinges on balancing transparency with security, methodological clarity with model complexity, and domestic accountability with global engagement. Its founders once worried about bomber gaps and radar arcs. Today's analysts worry about algorithmic accountability gaps and quantum arcs. The through line remains a faith that rigorous, multidisciplinary inquiry, conducted with ethical guardrails and subjected to public scrutiny, can illuminate choices that would otherwise be made in darkness or demagoguery. The jury is still out on whether that ideal can survive an era of instantaneous outrage and geopolitical fracture, but RAND continues to bet, as it did in 1948, that better analysis leads to better policy, and that democracy gains strength when its options are mapped in full, even when the maps are uncomfortable to read.